Hello, everybody, and welcome to this series on Was It Really? And today I wanted to present on a very interesting topic. Was the Hell Creek Formation really like the Florida Everglades? So let me get my notes in order and let's begin. The common idea. When people imagine the world of Tyrannosaurus rex, they often picture it along the lines of something similar to the Florida Everglades. A vast, warm wetland full of swamp forests, crocodiles lurking in the water, garfish swimming through the slow rivers, and dense vegetation dominated by conifers and flowering plants. And to be fair, this is completely understandable and completely reasonable. Hell Creek was indeed very swampy. Hell Creek, of course, is preserved today in rocks that are in a very semi-arid, in cold environment in Montana, the Dakotas, and Wyoming. But back then, it was swampy, and it had many wetlands, rivers, floodplains, and forests that look surprisingly familiar in some ways. There were even familiar plant groups in both areas. The forests included conifers, some of them even sharing the same species as the Everglades, for example, Taxodium. The Everglades and Hell Creek, of course, also share large flowering plant assemblages, such as magnolia relatives and laurels. And the fossil record even suggests monocots like palms and cycads being present. And the Florida Everglades also has palms and cycads. Yes, there is a native cycad to the Florida Everglades, but the FDA doesn't want you to know about it because they want you to be starchless. Hopefully, RFK will fix this soon. Anyways, the waterways were home to fish groups that also still exist today, like gars, which are also found in the Everglades. And just like the Everglades, Hell Creek had crocodilians, or at least other pseudosuchians, living in its waterways. It was warm, it was wet, and the winters rarely experienced deep, sustained freezes. So it's easy to see why people compare Hell Creek to the Everglades. But if we had to actually look at the science, we discover something interesting. Hell Creek may have been swampy, like the Everglades, but the climate was very different. So let's understand the modern Everglades. And before we compare the two, we need to understand the climate of the modern Everglades in a bit of detail. The Everglades sits in southern Florida, and its climate is a mixture of several Köppen climatic types. Much of the region falls under humid subtropical or CFA. I'll get to these weird abbreviations later. But other parts of the climate are tropical savanna, so AW, and of course AM, which is tropical monsoon. What this means in simple terms is that the Everglades is warm year round. The average winter temperature for the Everglades is about 66 degrees Fahrenheit or roughly 18 degrees Celsius. The average winter temperatures, or sorry, the average winter minimums are around 53 degrees Fahrenheit, and the average highs in the winter are around 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Summers are even hotter. Typical summer temperatures range from 67 degrees Fahrenheit to 87 degrees Fahrenheit, but heat waves can push this even higher. The Everglades is also extremely wet. The region receives around 60 inches of rainfall per year, sometimes even more, and most of it falling during the summer wet season. So overall, the Everglades climate is very warm year round, even hot in the summer, extremely humid, and almost never experiences frost except on a few odd occasions. But to really compare these climates, we need to understand how scientists classify climate types and what these weird abbreviations you might be seeing even mean. Okay, Köppen, as I believe is how you pronounce his name, was a German climatologist who came up with the, well, didn't necessarily come up with the modern way, but came up with the foundations of what we call the Köppen classification system. Now, how does this work? Well, number one, it's the most widely used climate classification system in the world. And the system divides climates into several major groups based on temperature and rainfall patterns. A, type A climates, in terms of the groups included, are tropical climates, and all months, or at least the winter months, have to be above 64 degrees Fahrenheit or 18 degrees Celsius. Dry climates are where are usually classified as B, and these are areas where evaporation exceeds the amount of rainfall. Climate type C is the temperate climates. So these include your subtropical and your ocean and several other types of climates we'll get into. Mild winters, where the coldest month usually stays below above freezing, but far below those of tropical temperatures. Some of them have warm to hot summer temperatures. Continental climates, depending on how you classify them, could be a type of temperate climate, but these usually have winter temperatures that go below freezing on average, and polar climates are you're in the Arctic and Antarctic, and these usually have dry seasons but also major dry cold seasons, but also have very very cold winters, and their summers tend to be very mild, or sometimes they can be hot, but they also are usually the areas where you find permafrost. So, how does this compare to Hell Creek? And so, how can we use this and compare to the Everglades and look at Hell Creek at the same time? And what do we know about the environment of Hell Creek in accordance with the Köppen climate classification? Well, what does the science say about Hell Creek? Well, one of the most important studies on the topic was published in 2014. In this study, scientists examined fossil leaves preserved at the base of Hell Creek, the Hell Creek Formation in Montana. The leaves were extremely well preserved, making them ideal for reconstructing ancient climates. The researchers used two main methods, and and of course, both of them had to do a bit with leaves. So the first one was leaf margin analysis. Scientists noticed that plants in warm climates tend to have smooth-edged leaves, while plants in cooler climates tend to have more toothed leaves. By counting how many fossil leaves had smooth edges versus how many had serrated edges, scientists can estimate the ancient temperatures. The other one is clamp. Okay, I said that too much. And no, it is not that weird thing you're into, I swear. The second method, of course, being called CLAMP or Climate Leaf Analysis Multivariate Program, is a bit more complex. Instead of just looking at leaf edges, it analyzes multiple leaf traits, including shape, size, and structure, and compares modern plants growing in known climates to these structural similarities of the fossil plants. Using these methods, researchers can estimate ancient climate conditions with surprising accuracy. Scientists have also studied fossil plants from other locations in the western interior of North America, including much of southern North Dakota and even Colorado. And together, these fossils reconstruct the climate near the end of the Cretaceous period in North America. And so we get the numbers for Hell Creek. From this research, the scientists estimated the average annual temperature of Hell Creek was about 11.3 to 11.6 degrees Celsius or 52.3 to 52.9 degrees Fahrenheit. At a glance, this number doesn't really tell us much. But the study also estimated something very important: the average temperature of the coldest month, and that value was around 2.6 degrees Celsius or 36.2 7 degrees Fahrenheit. For comparison, fresh water usually freezes at 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So the Quail Creek winter temperatures were cold enough to approach freezing, but they stayed slightly above it on average. We don't know the winter minimum, but we do know just the plain average of the winter, or at least a given cold month. This tells us something very important. Hell Creek was not tropical, so it was not climate classification A. Tropical climates again require if the climate to stay above 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit, but Hell Creek was far colder than that. So, however, one thing I just want to note, Hell Creek still does not classify as a continental climate, and so we stay remarkably temperate. And so we get our first kind of value for the Köppen classification. C, it's temperate. All right, next we have to look at summers. Hell Creek summers. The warmest month in Hell Creek averaged around 20.1 to 20.5 degrees Celsius or 68.2 to 68.9 degrees Fahrenheit. Under the Köppen class system, that counts as a warm summer but not a hot one. So we can't use A, but we can use B. So, well, we have the final value, which is the summer value. But let's go find the middle value, which has to do with rainfall. The final factor here is rainfall. Hell Creek received an estimated 191 to 197 centimeters of rain per year, or 75 to 78 inches. This is actually more rainfall than the modern Everglades gets, actually. And however, did want to also note something. The evidence suggests that Hell Creek did not have a strong seasonal dry period. This isn't to say Hell Creek never had droughts, but this is to say that summer that the dry periods were not strongly attached to summer, for example. So the rainfall was distributed throughout the year with no designated dry period. So we get our final value, which is F. So putting all this together, we get a climate type of CFB. And what does this tell us? Well, this climate type, CFB, is a type of oceanic climate, sometimes called the marine west coast climate. Now, this sort of climate today tends to have mild winters, cool to warm summers, and even rainfall year round. So the temperature overall is actually very mild. Today, things of CFB usually occur around small, tiny areas of the Pacific Northwest, parts of the Appalachians, parts of South America, including parts of Chile and things like that. Much, if not, well, actually most of New Zealand, parts of Southern Australia, half of Western Europe, small parts of Africa, and small parts of Asia. There's actually a small one here. And of course, especially in some areas of South Africa. So much of Western Europe does indeed compose of this sort of climate. So a place like England, like London, for example, is infamous for its rain. Rainfall is evenly distributed through much of the year. The temperature is rather mild. It never gets too hot, but it's usually a bit chilly. So if you were in Hell Creek, you would probably get very mild temperatures. So going back to comparing Hell Creek to the Everglades, and now we can finally compare the two. The Everglades average winter temperature is about 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Even the average minimum is about 53 degrees Fahrenheit. But the Hell Creek's average winter temperature is only 36.7 degrees Fahrenheit. This is dramatically cooler. Now, again, we don't know the exact minimum temperatures Hell Creek experienced, but it is very possible the region occasionally experienced frost and even occasional light snowfall during colder years. That means Hell Creek's winters were mild, but definitely cooler than southern Florida. So if you were to travel back in time to Hell Creek, you might actually wanted to bring a sweater with you. The cooler climate also affected the ecosystem. The climate actually only had a growing season of 6 to 7 months, yes. And in contrast, the Everglades essentially has a year-round growing season. So, what was Hell Creek actually like? So, if the Hell Creek was in the Everglades, it was probably most similar to parts of the Pacific Northwest, maybe parts of North Carolina, much of New Zealand, and some of the coastal areas of um, Europe. So what we have basically is wet forests, mild temperatures, and relatively cool summers. But most importantly, some of these areas rarely experience deep freezes, but they're noticeably cooler than tropical environments and even majority of the subtropical environments. For example, here am currently living in Austin. I believe the average winter temperature is usually between 44 to 66 degrees Fahrenheit, which makes Austin's winters much warmer than Hell Creek's. Oh, Jesus. So was Hell Creek like the Everglades? Well, yeah, in some ways, sure. It featured similar wetlands, swamp forests, crocodilians, fish-like gars, and vegetation was surprisingly similar in similar plant groups. But things like the seasonal variation, the growing season, and the overall temperatures were not very similar. And it's when you consider Hell Creek in its own league, consider it a type of climate, consider it a type of environment that we don't really have anymore. These sorts of very sorry, not cold, but mild swamp forests with subtropical flora and crocodilians. It's just not something we truly have today. But it is an interesting look into a prehistoric environment that was unique. And so, while yes, the Everglades can be used to compare Hell Creek to some extent, it's worth noting that perhaps things like the Pacific Northwest or New Zealand shouldn't be dismissed so readily, and they perhaps even at times have a much closer growing season and overall climate to Hell Creek. And so I leave you with this. Hell Creek may have been cooler, it may have been much different, but it most certainly was wetter than, of course, the Everglades, but we have to consider Hell Creek on its own merits and the fact that it was really soaking wet. Don't talk about the weather in the comments, I swear. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope to see you next time. Peace.